People need to have this really honest conversation with themselves and say, listen, you're not voting for you, you're voting for your people. You're voting for a future which we all share. And if you choose not to vote today or tomorrow or the next day, you forfeit the ability to complain about it and to be taken seriously. So that's my tough love response.
And honestly, I think that that's a great way to sort of encapsulate this conversation. I'm really big about impact, and I think that was a very impactful statement. So I'll follow by saying, right, October 26th.
October 26th is the big day. It's when we vote. Instagram and TikTok at Cory Deville.
Okay, perfect. Make sure you vote, check out Corey, but more importantly, do something. Like stop complaining, get off your ass, and get in a booth and make a vote, all right?
Even if it's not for me, at least come to the table with an opinion and the willingness to action it for tomorrow.
Okay, we're on. All right, so I'm very excited for today's podcast of Blissful Ignorance. I am joined today by Cory Deville. I like to call Cory Deville the Batman of mayors because essentially, right? Okay, potential mayors, right? He is not the mayor that Toronto has previously wanted, but he is the mayor that Toronto currently needs, right? And we were just talking about how the reception or like how you're being received throughout the city is very different. And it's funny because like the demographic that's on Instagram versus the demographic that's on TikTok is sort of having like different feedback. I'd love to hear more about that.
So for those who don't know, my name is Cory Deville, and I'm running for mayor of Toronto on a people-focused platform. And all that really means is things like rental affordability, food accessibility, and mental health are the very foundation of my campaign. Because without them, we have nothing. But on the topic of how I'm being received, Odie and I were just talking about the difference between Instagram and TikTok, and how you can say the same thing on both platforms and get wildly different responses. And what I think is happening is TikTok appeals to the Gen Zers, that youthful roar against the powers that be. And so naturally, idealism and progressiveness will thrive on TikTok. Instagram, comparatively, I think maybe resonates a little bit more with our generation, millennials. And it seems to be predicated on this idea of practical thinking, incremental implementations of ideas, and really going not from A to Z, but A to B and then B to C. And we were joking around. I was just telling him that, I can say the same thing on both platforms. I can be heralded as a hero on one and villainous on the other. So I've learned to adjust my messaging to the audience, which at first blush sounds like pandering, but it's not. There's a philosopher, his name is Derrida. Arguably crazy, as all philosophers are, but he wrote this book called The Monolingualism, and he said that language exists for the other. Meaning, I know what I'm thinking in my head, and you know what you mean in your head, but the goal in language, even if we were speaking the same one, is to translate our idea into a format that makes sense to the audience. So TikTok versus Instagram, they speak different languages. And I think it's on candidates and really anyone that's operating in the public space to ensure that what we are saying is articulated in a way that is not personally satisfying, but in a way that will make sense to the person you want to communicate with. So.
Yeah, honestly, I really vibe with that. Actually, from my background in sales and marketing, I call that empathetic communication. Because early in my life, I always struggled with the fact that I'd be trying to tell somebody something like a concept, right? And they wouldn't understand. It would frustrate me. Then I would start getting angry. Then I realized I'm speaking to them in a way that I understand. I'm not speaking to them in a way that they understand. And what I really like about that, what I really like that's really refreshing, is that you are taking that approach. Because for the most part, from my experience in Canada, not just at the municipal level, but also on the provincial level and the federal level, politicians speak a language that honestly almost nobody can understand. It just sort of flies over everybody's head, right? Like it is very prototypical to have the politician that obfuscates an answer. You know what I mean? And again, the reason why I like you is that I think right now we're at an inflection point. Okay, we're at an inflection point where the status quo can no longer be tenable. It's no longer tenable, right? And it's funny because even if you bring up the demographics between Instagram and TikTok, obviously I could be incorrect here, but generally I think TikTok sways obviously, as you're saying, more Gen Z. Instagram's more like millennial, maybe a little more Gen Xers as well too. And I think what's happening, even on from a demographic perspective, is for the younger generation, they're in positions right now where it's like they took on mass amounts of debts to go to school. They can't get a job. They can't service their debt. They can't get they can't live. They live objectively in a sense of hell, or let's say like stagnation, right? And I feel so. I feel like they're a lot more receptive to more what people would call radical, let's say, like statements, but in reality, it's just more so speaking towards the radical reality that they live in right now. And the interesting thing right now is that I feel like for a lot of millennials, that reality is becoming real as well too. As we see mass layoffs, as we see essentially the decimation of the private sector, as we see essentially like defaults and foreclosures and of properties increase to all time highs for like 30 years. Going back and harker back to what I said, we need change. We need politicians that are actually going to be able to speak to us and explain to us, hey, why should we listen? Why should we vote for you? You know what I mean? And I really like the way that you approach that.
Thank you. Thank you. For those on Instagram Live, just to give you a bit of context, because I realized I didn't, currently doing a podcast with Odie, and we're talking all things politics in Toronto. So if you see me looking at the screen, talking to a faceless figure, that's my man over here. But yeah, no, I would agree with you in full, and I would even take it a step further. I don't think it is radical to want to survive. I don't think it's radical to want to be able to pay your rent. I don't think it's radical to want to have, access to mental health resources or food accessibility or any number of things you need to survive. And it's this paradigm of being told to be happy with crumbs that I think facilitates suffering in the future. It's like you can't expect a society to thrive if survival is the only concern they have. And I know with my messaging, and even other politicians or public-ish figures in the past or present, the instant you ask for more than the sufficient, you are too idealistic, you are greedy, you are X, Y, and Z. And that's the trap of classism. People who are affluent or who are, say, economically elitist, it is in their interest to keep you happy with the bare minimum. And the instant you stand above the grade, so say a tall poppy, or the instant you become a nail that refuses to be hammered down, you're labeled a problem. And in many respects, you are a problem. You're a problem to people who occupy the throne. You're a problem to people who are career politicians. You're a problem to people who are in the 1%. And the only way the working class, the ordinary person, the vast majority ever thrive is by being a problem in the face of injustice, destitution, and really insufficiency. So I'd say when you have the choice to be a problem, be the good sort of problem, be the right sort of problem, so long as you're championing the people.
That makes a lot of sense. So I would also think that right now, especially running in a city like Toronto, right? Obviously, the key word that you see in mainstream media pertaining to economy is a K-shaped recovery or a K-shaped economy. And essentially, literally what that means is that there's two realities. There's one side of the population that's very small in terms of their numbers, actually, that's doing very well, financially speaking. And there's a huge population that's not doing well at all. And obviously, Toronto being, like, in my humble opinion, right? Like, you can hate all you want, right? Toronto is the city in Canada, right? And because of that, obviously, you see, let's say, a higher representation of the people who are at that higher level of the K. You know, the top end of the K there, in comparison to the other population. So I would imagine that, like, as you're speaking, part of the challenge right now is like, how do you speak to both sides? You know what I mean? Like, how do you speak to like, I'll leave it at that. How do you speak to both sides of the city?
So the question being asked right now is, well, let me frame it a bit. So Toronto is made up of many different people. We're a very opinionated city, myself included. And the question really becomes, how do you satisfy the interests of multiple stakeholders? How do you make people at the table equally happy when what they want is very divergent? And I think this has to come back down to the beginning and really asking the question, you know, like, what does happy look like for the city of Toronto? Irrespective of where you fall on the economic ladder, irrespective of where you fall on the political spectrum of like far left or far right, what can we all agree is like baseline happy? And I think safety is one because it impacts anybody. Food scarcity is another. Mental wellness has to be a third. So that's my starting point, is can I find a common denominator in which all people can agree that is a good thing? And then I build up from there. I say, hey, okay, well, what would a return on investment look like for you, Mr. and Mrs. Business Person, who maybe is in the 2%? You arguably are motivated by profitability. You want to make money. All the power to you. Someone on the opposite end of the table who maybe is more focused on social impact and social justice, for them, happy or the ROI is living in a city where homelessness isn't doubling every couple of years, where food scarcity is an afterthought, where we're not seeing mental crises play out on the TTC. And the middle point there is a city that normalizes homelessness, a city that normalizes food scarcity, and a city that normalizes, say, potential homelessness by not being able to afford your rent is also a city in which consumers aren't spending as much money. It's a city in which businesses will not want to invest because the ground's very uneven. And so as you scale up and develop a return on investment for multiple stakeholder groups, it's on the duty of the mayor or whomever's leading that table to say that your interests are actually intertwined. There is no future in which your business thrives if the average person does not have the funds to spend. There is no future in which your business thrives if homelessness becomes normalized on our streets, because it impacts our tourism, it impacts our foreign investment, it impacts our nightlife, it impacts people's willingness to actually explore the city. And so when you have the conversation of how do you make everyone at the table happy, it's shifting the lens to say we're fundamentally on the same side. We're just fixated on different facets of the problem, but it needs to be one Toronto united because the problems interweave. So that's my starting point.
Yeah, and I would assume that there's some challenges there as well too, because like, okay, let's touch on a couple of things that were sort of spoken towards there on the economic front, right? From my perspective, again, I could be wrong, but the Canadian economy is predicated on the Canadian consumer and their spending, and they are on their last leg. So I think definitely from like a commercial perspective, companies are obviously very much so aware of cost of living and like how important consumers are to their business. Because obviously, if I don't have buyers, if I don't have customers, my company is going to suffer, right? But that seems like such a challenging question across the board in terms of like how do you deal with inflation? How do we deal like how do you deal even with commercial prices and like the inflated cost of doing business across the board, whether it be taxation, like red tape, also like cost of doing of buying and servicing goods and whatnot too, right? I would assume that's a challenge. Also considering the fact that like, so let me reposition that, right? From my perspective, the best ally of the consumer, the Canadian consumer, is the private sector. Okay, right? Because the private sector is the one that hires the majority of the consumers, right? And the private sector ideally is the one that could provide them the capital, essentially to allow for this, like the velocity of capital to happen, right?
Yeah.
Well, and right now, as I can tell, in Toronto, the private sector is suffering. Failure rate, the bankruptcy rate, insolvency rate for, let's say, restaurants, boutique gyms, honestly, any regular Joe, Jim, or Jackie in the city that's trying to start a business, they are suffering, right? Like it's almost impossible to do business right now in the city if you're not in the correct lane. Like what would you say to, let's say, them first before we start addressing the other people?
Yeah, I'd say so. I would zoom out a little bit and I'd say this is the reason why my campaign is people focused policy in partnership with local business. Because I recognize, and I think the ordinary person recognizes that if our local businesses cannot thrive, the opportunity costs will ripple and hit us too. There'll be less jobs available, nightlife will suffer, tourism will suffer, X, Y, and Z. So I'm cognizant that it cannot be an us versus them problem. It has to be one Toronto united, the people versus the problem. And with respect to that, I'd say we have to start at survival, cost of living, because a business cannot thrive without consumers. And if your consumer says, hey, my number one problem is not getting a new car. My number one problem is not dining out. It's affording rent. It's affording food. Until we address that problem first, any other problem truly becomes irrelevant in the eyes of the consumer. In terms of how these businesses thrive and scale up, this is why municipal government needs to work in partnership with provincial and federal actors. Because a lot of the financial instruments available to small businesses, they don't come from the city, unfortunately. They come from our friends in Doug Ford's camp. And for people on Instagram Live, I was going to use a different way to characterize Premier Doug Ford, but I am practicing restraint. So I hope you're proud of me. But on that point, I think that's really the reality of the situation is that we have to once again determine what is happy for all of us, irrespective of the things on fire in the periphery. And until we address those foundational issues, housing, food, mental health, genuinely nothing else can matter because the consumer does not care. So coming back to that idea of language exists for the other, if your consumer tells you, hey, I'd love to shop at your spot, but I have other things to address, you really get nowhere. So that's my general stance. It's not the answer people want. I think a lot of local businesses would prefer me to maybe put forward a more right-leaning policy perspective. They might want me to say, hey, local businesses must become the priority, but that's just not the case. And for anyone who tries to clip me there, just know we're recording the entire thing, so context matters. So that's my
Yeah.
stance.
And to add to that, I think people who are trying to go for the clip or the clickbaiters will like really miss the point because as a business owner, you definitely understand that concept. Like, my clients need to have the money to buy my products. If they don't have enough money, that means I have to reduce my prices. I can't run a business at those margins, right? So I think definitely understanding the health of the consumer is something that like business owners definitely do understand, and there is obviously a happy middle in between.
Yeah.
My next question would obviously be that, and you sort of touched on it in terms of like the cross lateral relationship that has to like happen between jurisdictions. So that would that would be my next question. Like, what would the nature be in let's say I'll ask it in this context, right? In a perfect world, what would Toronto's relationship be with the province, and what would Toronto's relationship be with the federal government?
Okay, so this message for people on Instagram Live, we're talking to Premier Doug Ford directly in his cab. I think in an ideal world, the relationship between Toronto and Ontario would be a relationship of partnership. It would be us saying, hey, Ontario is responsible for about 18% of Canada's GDP. Toronto is responsible for about 30 to 50% of Ontario's GDP. Meaning Canada as a nation and Ontario as a province, economically at least, can only thrive if Toronto thrives. Because we are the economic heart, and then two, we're facilitating economic opportunity nationwide. And so both parties need to agree, the city as well as the province. The next step is saying, hey, the duty of provincial government, so Doug Ford, I'm talking to you, the duty of the provincial government is to facilitate the success and the safety of all Ontarians. Irrespective of whether or not you live in Toronto, that must be something we agree on. And if we agree on that, then we must say things like a rental cap, things like rental affordability, things like not privatizing water, things like holding grocers more accountable to predatory pricing must enter the equation. And that's where the federal government would come into play. So until we start operating as one cohesive whole, irrespective of whether or not we're talking about municipal government, provincial, or federal, we really will get nowhere because we're playing tug of war with ourselves rather than with the problem itself. And this is where private sector gets into a little bit of trouble because most businesses arguably have that fiduciary obligation to their stakeholders to make more money. That's what companies care about. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but it becomes problematic when it is predatory in its approach. And so until you have government willing to actually call a duck and say, hey, I get that you, Mr. and Mrs. Grocer, want to make money, but if your prices are built around consumer suffering, we as government must step in and say that the only way to do business in Canada, the only way to do business in Ontario, and the only way to do business in Toronto is through the lens of offering value to all stakeholders, most of all your clients, the working class, the consumer. So I think that's what needs to happen, but to the credit of maybe the conspiracy theorists, of which I am sometimes one, there is this quality of political cronyism, and it kind of leads to another question where a lot of people say, hey, you know what? Let's say you win the mayorship or you win the election at a provincial or a federal level. Like, how do we know you won't flip the script or become corrupt or align yourself with the powers that be? How do we know these things? And it's a very valid question. And the candid truth is you'll never know. Much like if you propose to somebody and you want to spend forever and ever with them, you don't know if it'll end in a divorce or in a happily ever after. So all we can do is risk mitigate. We have to say, okay, how are we holding our leaders accountable such that we are preventing scenarios or mitigating scenarios in which they become misaligned with the average person? And so this is where you look at their history as a politician, you look at their messaging, and you ask yourself the question, are they willing to call problems out for what they are? So when I use the language of Doug Ford choosing not to have rental caps is inherently predatory, it's not calling me, or rather, it's not calling Doug Ford a predator. It is saying a policy which works against the average person is inherently predatory because the duty of government is to protect the ordinary person. And when it becomes antithetical, when it becomes oppositional, we have to use the language appropriate to the cause. This is where we cannot politically spin. It's where we cannot try to reframe. We must use the language that is most befitting of the problem. Uniquely, the language that the ordinary person is using. If I can't pay my rent because government policies work against my interests, it's predatory. And that is the sort of energy we need from our political leaders moving forward if we are agreed that cost of living is a problem. If we are agreed that we only succeed if we all thrive, and if we are agreed that we're tired of bargaining for crumbs. So that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely in line with you because, again, like I said, status quo is not working. The oligarchic nature of how this country is set up, and specifically Ontario, is not working. And I would assume that like the Galen Westons of the world probably have to feel the same way. Hey, sure, economies of scale. It's great that I own like half, whatever. I have an oligarchy of the grocers and
One
other.
in three, baby. 1 in 3 goes through
But
it.
then but at the end of the day, if my customers can't buy the product, I still like the company suffers. At some point, that has to become reality because the unfortunate reality, and this is just OT spin on it. The unfortunate reality is a lot of commerce, from my perspective, in Ontario is inherently predatory. Whether it's real estate, whether it's consumer goods, right? So I definitely agree. There needs to be a bit more of like a serious conversation about accountability and how we basically protect the average Canadian versus how we protect the Canadian company. And maybe it's not exactly servicing the Canadians themselves the best, right? That's a whole conversation in itself. However, there is one thing I do want to talk about that's obviously a massive point in the city right now: homelessness. Okay, right? Every single person right now, it's almost like a trope. If I take the 501 or the 503 after 6 p.m. on any given day of the week, I will see the craziest event of things happen at least 3 times within 5 stops, right? I personally think, and this again, this is my perspective on it, right? I personally think that like there's a happy middle in terms of where we're at with homelessness because I don't agree with the integrity TO side of things, right? Where it's just like, get rid of these bums. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, these were people. There's a reason why they're on the street. And that reason needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you're not going to stop the pipeline of, let's say, regular individual to being on the street, right? And I guess, though, like at the scale it is right now, it seems a bit difficult to deal with. But, like, what's your perspective on, like, homelessness in the city and, like, its attachment to the mental health crisis and, let's say, even, like, the drug crisis happening?
Yeah, for sure. So
Yeah.
for those on Instagram Live, we're now pivoting to the topic of homelessness and how it impacts the city and I think really the TTC experience. So Michael, what's going on, man? I am very well, thank you. I don't need to take the TTC as often because I moved. So that's why you haven't been seeing me. But stay on the live because we're talking about something that uniquely applies to the TTC. And because you work for the TTC, I'd love for you to chime in and I'll interweave it into the podcast. So bird's eye view, I would agree with you. I think that there are 2 camps, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the homelessness crisis. One camp wants to see it removed. They're tired of it, they understand it, but they're tired of it. The other camp wants to see it fixed. They can empathize with people who are unhoused, and they realize that no one grows up wanting to be homeless. I often actually, and I hesitate to use the phrasing play the game, but I perform the mental exercise, we'll say. I'll look at someone who's unhoused and I'll ask myself, when they were 5 years old, who were they? When they were 10 years old, what did they want to be when they grew up? And what between the ages of 5, 10, and adulthood fell apart or broke? And this could be anything from trauma, households navigating crisis, a parent or parents or a guardian who was navigating crisis and so you inherited the trauma, or any laundry list of problems that got them from where they were to where they are now. My stance is somewhere in the middle. I say that I would lead with tough love. I think that what the city is doing right now, truthfully, is negligent. I would say that homelessness is not a new problem. We've tried many different solutions and none of them have worked. And we can say none of them have worked because statistically, homelessness since I think 2021 to now, it's actually doubled. It's gone from 7,500 to 15,000. So clearly, the inputs we're using, the policies, the programs, the X, Y, and Zs, they're not generating a return on investment. And so we have to come back to the table and say, hey, okay, you know what? Like we're putting these things in a box and it's not producing the cake. Maybe the ingredients are wrong. So that's my first stance on it. My solution, and I want to use air quotations here because it's not a perfect solution and it never will be, is to say that if homelessness statistically is linked to a mental health crisis and if homelessness is perpetuated by substance abuse, irrespective of how you got there, and this could be rents that are unaffordable, this could be personal trauma, this could be abuse of any kind. Once we get to a position of homelessness and substance abuse, which is what I think, honestly, a lot of people in Toronto, that's how they view it, even though that is not the genuine problem, we have to say, okay, if we're going to provide affordable housing and we're going to provide solutions to food scarcity and we're going to provide solutions to mental health crises, let's also add in job training and let's also add in a guaranteed job, even if it's part-time employment, because our goal cannot be to take someone who is drowning from the deep end and move them to the shallow end. Because you can drown in a bathtub of water. Like that does not solve the actual problem. We need to remove people from the crisis itself. And some aspect of that has to find this middle ground between aggressive intervention that is not forceful and then maintaining someone's agency. Which is to say that if someone were drowning, I would not first ask them permission. Can I save you? Are you okay? I would be focused on removing you from the water, getting you to a place in which you are healthy and able to sustain yourself, and then saying, hey man, like, how did you get to a position where you were drowning? Like, what led to that and how can I interrupt it? And then on the point of a community in Toronto who is unhoused and mental health crisis, and I hesitate a little bit to use the phrasing homelessness as opposed to unhoused, just because
Yeah.
of the connotation.
Yep.
But when I say it, no, I'm using them interchangeably. But when I'm looking at the TTC and homelessness as a problem, that's when I think we need stronger intervention. It's like allowing a crisis to happen on the 501 TTC, which
Yeah.
for anyone who's ridden it after 9 p.m., it's rife with homelessness and substance abuse, irrespective of whose fault it is. The point is, it does happen a lot on that particular route. That's when it becomes problematic. The TTC is aware, but it's not their job to intervene in a mental health crisis. It's the job of mental health practitioners, it's the job of city council to provide the TTC with staff who are appropriately trained to neutralize the issue. And when we say neutralize, we mean solve. But that's, I think, where it has to come into play. It has to be this scenario of tough love and saying, hey, do we want to, one, solve the problem, or do we just want to put a band-aid on it and feel good? And that's where I think people and organizations like Integrity TO, I think that's what they're really trying to point towards and say, hey, listen, I'm not a monster, but what you are doing is negligent, it's ineffective, and we can prove it looking at the data. Why are we not trying something that is at the very least a little more assertive? So that's my stance on it, generally speaking. If I were to go even further, I would just give people the option to say, hey, you know what? The city's going to create a new solution for you. It's going to wed rental affordability, food accessibility, mental health, job training, and a job, but it's contingent on you participating in an 18-month rehabilitation program. That's the condition. If you want these things in the expanded form, you must participate in this program because clearly you're not able to solve the problem, and the city has been unable to solve the problem in days of past. What do you think? And this came to mind because I was speaking to a lot of nurse practitioners who work uniquely with people who are unhoused and uniquely with people who navigate substance abuse. And they said the number one problem that they have is even when we remove someone from being unhoused and we remove someone from the cycle of substance abuse, the instant we release them back into society, they spin out of control because they're back in the same environment that facilitates the problem. And so if you imagine you take a shower and you're clean and you're ready to take on the day, if your environment is a dirty environment, if your environment is an unhealthy environment, and if your environment is antithetical to you succeeding in life, thriving in society, and really just being happy, it's no wonder that you return to the inevitable loop. And so I think that's where the city has to intervene. It says, hey, I cannot make a horse drink water, but I can offer you a cleaner pond. I can offer you a healthier pasture. but it is on you to take that first step. And it is on you to give me permission to hold your hand and guide you to those better tomorrows. So that was my broader stance on the issue.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I am seeing more the relevance of your people focused approach because essentially, if you build the individual person as a block, then the whole structure itself should get stronger, right? And I personally think, at least I can speak for Toronto, that's not the case. They're not concerned about the individual, right? Um, yeah, because I think whether you look at it as an individual, as a consumer, or as a person, at the end of the day, if you build that block of a person, you will actually build a better society. Because personally, myself, I also agree with you. This is just my perspective on it. I think personally, I think as a society, like we need a cultural shift. Every time, so like people that live downtown Toronto are gonna know the spots I'm talking about. Okay, so King and Bay, all right, FCP outside BMO. There was always one unhoused person outside of a grate there, right? It's like a marble tower, and then you have this unhoused person on a grate. People walk over that person. Like I'm talking about thousands of people, right? 137 young on a good life, right? There's generally an unhoused person there as well too. People walk over that person, and my thing is, I feel like as a society, we should feel like the society is sick to allow that to happen. It shouldn't even just be an individual issue. It should be like a cultural problem. And I will say to highlight some positive things. The other day I was at Dundas Square,
Yeah.
and there was an individual who was going through like it's one of those typical things where it's a person passed out on the sidewalk. Everyone's walking by. No one's even checking if the person's alive or not. But somebody did stop to check and provided them medical assistance, and that was for me very refreshing. You know what I mean? Because as soon as one person did, everybody else is concerned about that individual. And I think it's just that shift of realizing, hey, this is not okay, right? Like we all need to figure out a way to come to a solution for this. And I also believe personally myself, I have some unhoused friends that live on the street that try to help every now and then. They don't want to be in that position. It's a question of like, how do you provide them hope that there is a better future or solution, or for lack of a better term, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Because I think for a lot of people in the city, they've given up, right? And I think you sending a message of hope, or essentially, yeah, like sending a message to the individual person that somebody does have your back,
Yeah.
somebody is trying to provide you a solution. I think that in itself is like the positive element of your campaign.
But even more than that too, it's like I want to ensure, and I agree with everything you're saying. And for those on Instagram Live, we're talking about the unhoused crisis, substance abuse, and really the city's reaction and negligent reaction to it. On that topic of hope, back in 2022, I used the language of the defiant hope. And to my mind, I thought, okay, you know what? I want to tell people that there's someone rallying for them, but I realized that's actually not good enough. Hope in itself does not solve the problem. And that was a learning moment for me. Because to your kind of story about someone being unhoused and having a crisis on the street and everyone walking over them, my second thought, so the first one being this is a tragedy, but my second thought is it's interesting that dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people see the problem, are aware it's happening and choose to ignore it, but then still parrot this righteous empathy. Because I think, okay, well, the majority of people think that this is a problem and it's a tragedy. Why is it that the majority of people are not intervening to help solve it? Everyone donate 50 cents. Scale that up to 10,000 people. You have enough for first, last, and say rent for the next 6 months. And so because that's not happening, I realize one, hope in itself is not enough. It is requisite to the solution, but it's not sufficient. And then two, this is where pragmatism comes into play. And so that's why I say things like, until we begin to see rental affordability, food accessibility, and mental health as one cohesive problem, and until our policies address all three simultaneously, we'll get nowhere. So I posit the idea such that Toronto just needs to start building. You know, we have a real estate portfolio of $27.6 billion. We own 8,400 buildings in the city. We have an entire agency called Create TO, and their job is to develop real estate in the interest of the city. And if the average person in the city is saying, hey, rental affordability is a problem, hey, homelessness is a problem, it would behoove us not to look at that portfolio and say, out of the 8,400 buildings we own, are there any buildings that we can convert into affordable housing? Out of all of the land we own, is there any land property or any lots that we can build a low-rise unit on, where we build, say, 5 or 10 stories? because they go up faster, they're cheaper to build, they're more insulated from market cycles, they're more eco-friendly. And until the city begins to adopt this mentality of we must be the ones to save ourselves from drowning, there is no help coming from the provincial level or even the federal level right now. We will get nowhere. And so this is where my mentality of hope is requisite, but it's not enough comes from. That we cannot be looking to go from A to Z. We have to truly approach this incrementally and say, what can the city do to affect rental affordability for all? Not just people on the most extreme ends of the spectrum, but really for all. We really will not affect change. So that's kind of my stance on it. And it's something that I like to really drill into because people at large sort of skirt the issue. They'll idolize the problem. They'll say, hey, there's no rental caps, I can't afford rent. Granted, we're all aware. They'll say, hey, there's a rental crisis or a cost of living crisis in Toronto, but they'll stop there. That is the actual problem. It's the complacency. And this is where, and I'll say it very candidly, this is where people like Olivia Chow or Brad Bradford or genuine career politicians are the problem. And so for Instagram Live, Brad Bradford, Olivia Chow, I know you're not on my live right now, but when you inevitably see this, know that I am speaking to you. And this is not to disparage them as people, it's to say, hey, listen, if you're Councillor Brad Bradford and you've been in office for 8 years and you're running for mayor of Toronto and you're parroting the same messaging over and over and over, at what point do we say, listen, man, you've had 8 years, almost a decade, to solve this problem or meaningfully impact it? You've affected zero changes by way of rental affordability. You've affected zero changes by way of food accessibility. You've affected zero changes by way of mental health. At what point do we say career politicians and the typical faces you see at City Hall are insufficient to solve the problem? This is where radicalism needs to enter the equation, because playing it safely didn't get us anywhere. Being calm, cool, and collected did not get us anywhere. Yeah. There is a balance between entering a discussion or entering a City Hall debate and acknowledging the fact that, yes, I'll be rational. Yes, I'll be willing to listen to opinions that are maybe not reflective of my own, but there is an urgency necessary for the next mayor of Toronto to assume if they are to solve problems for the working class, because the problem is urgent to them. Someone who does not know if they're eating tomorrow is in a state of crisis. That requires urgency. And it's why leaders need to not just parrot it in their speeches, they need to embody it in their policies. They need to be willing to call out people like Premier Doug Ford and say, hey, listen, man, your policies are predatory because they directly hurt the people who got you into office. We need to start using the language of, hey, Councillor Brad Bradford, it is absurd that you're running for mayor of Toronto when you as a city councillor were unable to prevent city council from giving itself a 25% pay increase, taking their base pay from $130,000 per year to $173,000 per year. Yes, Brad Bradford, I know you did not vote yes on that, but you weren't able to convince the other 24 city councilors that doing that would be a bad idea during a cost of living crisis. How could you possibly be a good mayor? Because that would be the gig. It would be getting 25 city councilors to agree on policy that is people focused. 25 city councilors to agree in action policy that is people focused. 25 city councilors to agree that the only policies we should move forward are those policies that champion the working class. That's the statistical majority. So unless you are sitting on $1 billion, you are working class. Unless daddy or mommy is connected with the 1%, you are working class, even if you're a business owner. And it's getting city council, it's getting city councilors, it's getting the city, it's getting local businesses, and it's getting the future mayor of Toronto to acknowledge that as our starting point. That is the gig. And if that is not what you're here to do, candidly speaking, you shouldn't be running. Yes, I'm talking to Brad Bradford. If you are unable to do this after 25 years, you need to retire. Yes, I'm talking to Olivia Chow because it has not worked. So that's my stance.
I really like that. I really like that. So I have a question for you, okay? Right? And so, like, this would be my thing. So a man like Brad Bradford exists in Toronto politics for a reason. Because I'll go back to what I said before about the mayor the city needs and not the one that they deserve necessarily. Because I feel like a guy like Brad Bradford and a mayor like Olivia Chow is the mayor the city's deserved. And I would say that because honestly, for the most part, Toronto, from my personal experience, is politically uninvolved. They don't really participate in politics, right? And for the majority, you go to elections, you see a name like Brad Bradford, the most generic white bread name I've ever seen in my life. And you pick that name because you don't know the guy. It's the safest name that you go to, right? That's why a guy like Brad Bradford has any credibility in politics, right? His name is super generic and it passes the look test, right? Olivia Chow is the mayor of Toronto because she was the wife of the late Jack Layton, who was one of the most popular politicians in Canadian history. That's the truth of the matter. Anybody that says differently is incorrect. I'm sorry about it. She doesn't have any political acumen. She went to Caribana, which is wonderful. Policy-wise, she hasn't done anything different, and she hasn't done like anything for the city. Anybody that's actually living here knows that, right? So my question would be here, and it's not even really a question. My question would be more so like a challenge to the city, right? Me myself, a Toronto man, okay, right? I challenge my city. The rest of the six, okay? How do you get these people to get out of their houses and to get into a voting booth and to do something for themselves rather than complain every 4 years and go on Torontology and talk about oh this and oh that and da 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 da. My challenge would be to Torontonians. You know what I mean? How do you, Corey? How do you convince us Torontonians, Torontoites, whatever you want to call it, right, to come out and make a decision that's beneficial to ourselves?
No, for sure. This is a good question. I actually was asking myself this 2 years ago. So for those on Instagram Live or for those who are going to see this at a later point in time, the question is, how do you get people to vote for themselves and to get out of a place of complacency? How do you get the working class person, arguably one of the most vulnerable classes in the city, to get out and vote for candidates and for policy that directly benefit them when they've been living in a crisis for years? And I think I will do two things. One, I'm actually going to give Olivia Chow her flowers. They're not very big flowers, but they are. I'm kidding. I will say that it takes a certain level of stamina as a human being to be in politics for 25 years. That is something that Olivia Chow has that I do not. It's something that Mayor Olivia Chow has that no one on City Council can also say they possess. And I'm not naive to that reality, but I think that truthfully, people need to decide, do we want to play things safe and just get by, or do we actually want change? And so I would do the following. My message to the city of Toronto is like, listen, what's your plan if you don't vote for me? What would be your plan, say, if I wasn't even running? Say your options were Olivia Chow and Brad Bradford. On the one hand, you have Olivia Chow. She's a familiar name. She's been in politics for 25 years. Your parents probably know who she is. So there's familiarity, it seems less risky. Then there's Brad Bradford. Some people know who he is, and some people, I'll bet not a lot, resonate with him a little bit. But does that give you a solution to your problem? No. Because if the solution were there, it would have been reified in the last decade. So my solution to getting people to vote is to say, hey, listen, what's going to happen come October 2026? The 26th, if you do not vote for a candidate who is people focused in their policy, even if it's not me, but say a candidate who's people focused, is the far right, the top 1%, the private actors that we all hate that act as, say, multinational corporations, what they will say to you is, hey, listen, you guys had an opportunity to change your lives. There was a candidate running who said, my platform is built around the working class. My platform is built around people-focused policy. My platform is built around people-focused policy in partnership with local business. There was a candidate who was championing rental affordability, food accessibility, mental health. There was a candidate championing the development of our creatives in the city, remembering that Toronto's tourism economy is $9 billion. The vast majority of that comes from our creatives, our writers, our singers, our rappers, our film producers. You had a candidate saying all the things you wanted and you chose not to vote for him or vote at all. It is ludicrous to then extend empathy to the working class, because until you're willing to at least attempt to solve the problem yourself, why is market? Why will the powers that be take you seriously? That's the tough love that I give myself, that I give my friends and give my family. Where I say, you're not voting for you, you're voting for your mother, who may or may not be retiring, who may or may not be on a fixed income, who may or may not be navigating rental affordability. You're voting for your brother who wants to be more than the conditions he lives in will allow. You're voting for your friends who are trying to figure out what their happy is and how to get there. You're voting for the environment to say, hey, if you choose to have kids in the future, or if you choose to care about the future, it would be nice if the air was clean. It would be nice if we were living in concert with the environment. It would be nice if we built sustainability into the very design and architecture of Toronto. It would be nice if our youth could find a job. It would be nice if the innovators of today were afforded the funding and the platform and the opportunity to become the experts we will need to solve the problems of tomorrow. Those things would all be nice. Those things would all benefit everyone. But if you don't vote, how do you action it? Because advocacy does have its role. It does work, but it's not enough. I've marched in the streets during Black Lives Matter, which is going to be controversial for some people. I do not care, because I think that social injustice is a problem, not for one community, but for all. But if advocacy alone was enough, it would solve the issue, and it doesn't. You need institutional power. You need to be in the rooms where the decisions are made, and most importantly, you need to have a person in that room who has the capacity to make those decisions, be it creating bylaws at a municipal level, or eventually entering the provincial legislature and creating laws like a rental cap, which we would all love, on properties built after 2018, which is where rent evictions become a problematic issue. Because if I can tear down an old building and build a new one, well, guess what? I don't need to have rental caps anymore, because my building is now a 2026 build, even if it's the same building that was there for the last 20 years. So that's, I think, what needs to happen. People need to have this really honest conversation with themselves and say, listen, you're not voting for you, you're voting for your people. You're voting for a future which we all share. And if you choose not to vote today or tomorrow or the next day, you forfeit the ability to complain about it and to be taken seriously. So that's my tough love response.
And honestly, I think that's a great way to sort of encapsulate this conversation. I'm really big about impact, and I think that was a very impactful statement. So I'll follow by saying, right, October 26th.
October 26th is the big day. It's when we
You show up and you vote for my guy. You follow him on what?
Instagram and TikTok at Cory Deville.
Okay, perfect. Make sure you vote. Check out Corey, but more importantly, do something. Like, stop complaining, get off your ass, and get in a booth and make a vote, all right?
Even if it's not for me, at least come to the table with an opinion and the willingness to action it for tomorrow.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time you've taken today, Corey. Again, I'll say, man, as a young Black man, youngish, you taking the time to have these conversations with me make a huge impact. And it's not just me, it's my peers who see this type of thing, because it's definitely like a lack of genuine intent that happens, especially amongst politicians in Toronto. So I truthfully really appreciate that. And I hope everybody that's horizontal with me sees that as well, too. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the office.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you once again for having me. I must admit the biggest problem that I actually currently face is, even if you have great policy, if you don't have a platform to be heard, it falls on deaf ears. So Odie, I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to, one, platform me, two, interview me, and be exceptionally patient. Viewers at home don't know, we have been trying to schedule this redo for months, and it was on me. So thank you again. I genuinely appreciate that.
All good things take time, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. We'll end there.
All right, man.